Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody here in Geneva, but also to those of you who are joining online. This is the latest event in our action-packed Trade Environment Week here at the WTO. This morning's event, just in case you find yourself in the wrong place, is a spotlight on international collaboration to accelerate decarbonisation. And as we've been discussing in other events this week, we've obviously seen just over recent weeks, over this summer, the calamitous effect that climate change is already having on countries, whether it be the devastating floods in Pakistan or the heartbreaking famine that is affecting the Horn of Africa and bits of the Sahel as a result of the prolonged drought. And at the heart of our ambitions to try and deal with climate change lies the objective of halving global emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. That, as we all know, can't be done unless we manage to decarbonize our economies and make the most rapid possible cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. The faster we do that, the better we will be able to make low-cost clean technology accessible to all. And key to that effort to decarbonize our economies domestically lies international collaboration, which is what we're talking about this morning with initiatives such as the Breakthrough Agenda and the Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, or IDDI. I hope, as many people know, Breakthrough Agenda, launched by the UK and a coalition of 45 countries back at the World Leaders Summit at COP26 in Glasgow. It aims to accelerate the development and the deployment of clean technologies and sustainable solutions needed to meet our Paris goals, ensuring they're both affordable and accessible for all. So today's panel is going to provide presentations, first of all, on that Breakthrough Agenda, and in particular the steel breakthrough, given the significance of steel as a highly traded commodity, and then also look at the IDDI, coordinated by UNIDO and co-led by India and the UK, but also including Canada, Germany, United Arab Emirates, United States, and Saudi Arabia. IDDI is a global coalition of public and private organizations working to stimulate demand for low-carbon industrial materials that aim to promote decarbonization in specific carbon-intensive sectors like steel and cement. And I think, as we've kind of been talking about throughout this week and also at the Committee on Trade and Environment this week, this is all about, for us here in the WTO, about understanding the initiatives that are underway internationally, learning from them, and trying to identify how it is that we can use trade and trade policy tools to promote those environmental ends, in this case, decarbonization of our economies and the growth of clean technologies and their diffusion to the widest possible number of countries. And that obviously builds on our ministerial outcome document at MC12, which recognised the role that the WTO can play in addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So we've got a really rich panel, as ever, this morning, of speakers going to talk about all of this. We have, first of all, Stephanie Edwards, who is joining us from the British government's Ministry for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. She leads the team there that focuses on the Breakthrough Agenda. She's going to talk about that agenda more broadly and also kind of explain how it links to issues around carbon leakage. Then we've got Will Hall. Will is joining us from the International Energy Agency, and he will be presenting on their Breakthrough Agenda report recommendations on steel and looking at the extent of international collaboration in the steel sector. Then we have Rana Ghonaim, who's joining us from UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which coordinates that IDDI initiative, working to stimulate demand for low carbon industrial materials, including low emission and near zero steel. And then we're going to be joined, after those three kind of core panelists, by two sort of commentators, if you like. Michael Buchel from Germany, and Matthias Frumeri from Sweden. Michael is from the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action, and Matthias is from the Swedish Ministry of Environment and Climate. So we're going to kick off with presentations from our three key presenters, hear a little bit from the panel as a whole, and then open up to questions, both from those lucky few of you here in Geneva, but also to those of you joining us online this morning. And I think with a bit of luck and technological agility from our team, we're now going to watch a very brief video before we hear from Stephanie.
Our one planet is changing in front of our eyes. Blink, and it will be too late to save it. To protect and restore the natural world and secure humanity's future, we must halve global emissions by 2030. To achieve this, international collaboration is vital. Last year at COP26, 45 world leaders committed to the Breakthrough Agenda, an unprecedented worldwide plan to dramatically speed up the development and deployment of key clean technologies. Covering 5 sectors that together represent more than 50% of global emissions, the Breakthrough Agenda aims to make clean technology attractive, accessible, and affordable to all. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we need to reduce global emissions 5 times faster than we have over the last decade. We already have many of the technologies needed to transition to a 1.5 degree future. However, we need to go much further and much faster so no one is left behind. The global energy crisis underlines the urgency of increasing the affordability and accessibility of our power. Alongside this, the current global food emergency and extreme weather events have shown just how important it is to collaborate and future-proof essential industries. Real progress has been made since COP26, but the world remains far off track to limit the worst impacts of climate change. The Breakthrough Agenda report helps set the direction. We now need to respond by COP27, deliver priority projects, hold ourselves to account, and ensure collaboration is sustained and expanded every year for the benefit of everyone. Delivering the pace of change requires continued effort at every level of government and throughout the private sector. Securing the future we all want is possible. We must not let it slip through our fingers.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Steph.
Great, thanks so much, Simon, and hi everybody. It's great to be here. As Simon said, my name is Stephanie Edwards. I work in the UK government and head up the team that is running the Breakthrough Agenda. It's a really timely moment to have this discussion. We are nearly a year on from COP26 and about to go into COP27, where Egypt, as the host, have really rightly put a focus on implementation of the commitments we saw at COP26. So today I'll talk a bit more about what was agreed at COP26 on the Breakthrough Agenda, but more importantly, what's happened since, what are the future plans as well, to make all of this real and to make that goal of making clean technologies affordable and accessible real. So we all know that now 90% of global GDP is covered by a net zero target. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how much of a shift that is from just a few years ago. The question internationally has therefore turned away from or more towards how we actually meet those targets and how to set the rules for a new global green economy. That cannot be decided by any one country alone. We need a global response and a global effort to define that. That is exactly what the Breakthrough Agenda is all about. it is an agreement by 45 world leaders, together representing 75% of global GDP, to work together and collaborate to ensure that clean technologies are the most affordable and accessible option in all sectors by 2030. And those leaders included from those from the US, China, EU, and India, as well as kind of colleagues on this call as well. And the underpinning rationale beneath the Breakthrough Agenda is that working together, by countries working together in this way, we can help accelerate the transition by sharing best practice on R&D to drive faster innovation, coordinating action and demand side policies to drive greater economies of scale, coordinating efforts on finance, and helping ensure that the policy environment we create in each country is effective and works together as a global community. So underpinning this headline aim was also an agreement to review progress each year through the Breakthrough Agenda report, the first iteration of which you'll hear about from Will. I think if we have the slides up, I can also show you some specific plans that were made. So I think this is slide 5, thank you, for each of the 5 major emitting sectors globally. So there was a specific emphasis put on these sectors, given they represent about 50% of global emissions. And so world leaders agreed to more specific goals for each of these sectors. And most relevant for this conversation is the Global Agreement on Steel, where countries endorsed the goal to make near zero emission steel the preferred choice in global markets, with efficient use and near zero emission steel production established and growing in every region by 2030. Next slide, please. So a good way to think about what happens next is as a process. The Breakthrough Agenda is really a process that allows countries and the underpinning initiatives that we have already in the international landscape to review current efforts towards that headline goal, map the landscape of existing activity, and discuss and decide on opportunities to do better. Where do we need to do more, from everything from standards to finance, right through to R&D as well. It's worth saying that that's because the Breakthrough Agenda isn't actually doing the work needed to accelerate this transition. It's more of a political process that helps amplify and reinforce the right forums internationally that are doing the work, that are facilitating the collaboration needed. And really, all of this is informed by the Breakthrough Agenda reports. This is the independent report that was commissioned by world leaders, which will review progress and provide recommendations to governments about what more they need to do. And that's what Will Hall from the IEA will talk about today. We then, since that report's been published, which was published in September, each year this group of governments committed to publish in response a set of priority actions that will be taken forward, which will strengthen and reinforce existing efforts taking place to accelerate the transition in these sectors. So in summary, this is all about reviewing progress and identifying ways in which we can improve as an international community to enable us to speed up and scale up at the pace and scale required. Next couple of slides, please. I think we'll just jump to the one on carbon leakage, the one after this. So finally, just wanted to make sure in the context of WTO Environment Week, I also mentioned the links between this work and carbon leakage. And how to tackle carbon leakage is clearly a live debate right now. And we all know there is a significant risk that cheaper high carbon goods in the future undercut greener alternatives. And from our point of view, working through the Breakthrough Agenda, working with international coalitions to help define the future rules of the global green economy and and making the most of the opportunities to work together actually allows us to mitigate carbon leakage over the next decade and beyond by helping to grow the market for green technologies and ensure that businesses are supported in this transition as well. Now, of course, trade has a place in these conversations. Our trading system globally can enable or hinder the uptake of highly traded low emission goods. And where practical, regulatory cooperation, trade facilitation, mutual recognition of standards can help minimize barriers to trade for low carbon goods and keep everyone working towards a similar transition. That's why the UK, is part of and welcomes the TESSD group, which I know has helped develop some of these subjects of the WTO by sharing evidence, talking about some of the technical work that underpins this, and promoting awareness of carbon leakage. And we look forward to engaging in talking about some of the potential solutions, the role of trade policymakers, and how climate measures can also be designed in the least trade restrictive way as well. I'll pass back to you, Simon. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stefan. Really kind of interesting to hear about both the breakthrough agenda generally, but also the specific work on carbon leakage, which was a big issue already in the Committee on Trade and Environment at our discussions on Monday. We're now going to pass the floor from London to Vienna to Will Hall, the IEA. And Will, I think you're going to talk a bit about the work you're doing there on these same issues around the breakthrough agenda, and in particular on steel. Will, over to you.
Great. No, thank you very much, Simon. And yeah, thanks for inviting us to speak here today. So we are the kind of the other part of the process to Steph's component of the countries kind of setting out the actions, and to set out those actions, we at the IEA, alongside IRENA and the UN high-level champions, have made a series of recommendations to governments under the breakthrough agenda, so they can understand where are the real priority areas for international collaboration under those 5 breakthrough sectors that Steph covered. Given that we're at the WTO today, and also given my focus, I'm going to spend most of the time looking at steel and the impact that international collaboration can have on accelerating progress on international steel decarbonisation. So next slide, please. So just very quickly, the Breakthrough Agenda report, hopefully you've seen it. It came out in September. It was published in New York Climate Week, just ahead of the Global Clean Energy Action Forum in Pittsburgh. As I said, it's a collaboration between ourselves at the IEA, alongside IRENA and the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions. And the 4 main areas that it focuses on really is kind of where we need to get to by 2030. So everyone's on the same page about the kind of metrics that we need to deliver on over the next less than a decade now. Then how do we get there? So kind of what are the processes which both national governments, businesses, civil society need to take at a national level and an international level? So what's the kind of the totality of actions that need to be taken? And then really the focus of the Breakthrough Agenda is looking at international collaboration. So the third area we look at is kind of mapping out the current status of international collaboration. And I'll kind of share a bit of the landscape map that we've been looking at for steel in a bit. And then finally, the real kind of meat of the report is those recommendations. So all this analysis leads into, what do governments, business and civil society need to do over the next 1 to 2 years to kind of unlock the progress we need to see on a kind of a 1.5 degree aligned pathway out to 2030. And in future years, we're going to be kind of tracking and keeping an eye on countries and companies and initiatives about how they're doing against the recommendations that we've set in this year. And we're going to be repeating this report annually every year. So next slide, please. Great. So as I said, I'm going to zoom in a little bit on steel here. This is one of the 5 sectors that we cover, but is probably the most relevant for the trade discussions at the WTO. So I won't repeat the steel breakthrough goal that Steph mentioned, but that's at the top of the slide there. So these couple of charts just set out the kind of description that we set out in the report about where we need to get to by 2030. So for example, the millions of tons of near zero emission primary steel, that needs to increase by more than 100-fold between now and 2030. And then in terms of the average direct emissions intensity of steel production, that needs to fall by about 30% between now and 2030. So a really big task, given that we only have 8 years, and even less if you take into account the amount of time it takes to build one of these steel plants. We really don't have a huge amount of time to get on track for 2030. Next slide, please. So we also set out how we think you can get there. And in this chart, this kind of S-curve, indicative S-curve, trying to set out the actions to take to drive up the market share of near zero emission steel, which is on the y-axis. And the boxes are kind of organized into green boxes, which are more relevant for international collaboration, and gray boxes, which have maybe more national relevance. And then those boxes which are kind of outlined in black are the ones that come earliest in the process and that we've identified as the key recommendations for this report. So you can see there that a dialogue to enable near zero emission steel trade is one of the recommendations that I'll be covering in a little bit. We also cover kind of and give reference to other important national efforts, such as dialogues being held with communities at local level to plan transition. Also kind of countries implementing design regulations to promote longer lifetime and reuse, also at a national level. So I won't dwell too much on this, but do have a look at it within the report, and you can see the whole range of actions that will be required over the next decade. Next slide, please. So this is the landscape map that I spoke about. So what we've tried to do in each sector, each breakthrough sector, is try to plot out who is doing what, just to kind of give actors, particularly those who are new to the scene or those countries who are just arriving in terms of trying to better understand the steel decarbonisation landscape. We've kind of got really good feedback that this has been a really useful exercise for people to immediately understand, what's happening and where might there be some gaps in the years to come. So I guess for the relevance for this conversation, there's the Clean Energy Ministerial Industrial Deep Decarbonisation Initiative, which is under the standards and certification, as well as the demand creation and management kind of rows, which I know Rana is going to be speaking about in a little bit, and also more broadly on trade conditions. So how can countries and companies collaborate on trade conditions? There's the OECD Steel Committee, and I know some colleagues are on the call today, and also the WTO TESDI, which Steph also mentioned. So next slide, please. So in kind of lieu of this, in terms of understanding where we need to get to by 2030, what we need to do to get there, where the current landscape of international kind of collaboration sits. There are certain areas where we think there is enough being done. I think it's very rare for that to be the case, given how steep the rate of progress is required. What I've done here is kind of organize these recommendations with trade first, and kind of seeing how the other recommendations can build in and support a near zero emission steel trade. So the 5 areas that we recommend for countries to collaborate on is first is establishing this strategic dialogue to agree an approach on trade for near zero emission steel, which is rewarding first movers and not kind of penalizing them as they might be in today's markets, but also providing that support for a broader set of fast followers. So not making sure that we're kind of pulling up the bridge or pulling up the ladder behind the first set of fast movers, but providing conditions and support, which I'll come on to, for emerging and developing countries who are also looking to decarbonize their steel sectors. I think very much in support of that aim, and I think can be a key component of that dialogue, will be urgently agreeing common standards for near zero emission steel. And I'd like to kind of thank and congratulate again Michael from the German government for kind of pushing the G7 to take a first step in this, where there was a kind of agreed kind of common definition for near zero emission steel at the G7 Climate and Environment Ministerial this summer. So I think that kind of activity, in support as well with private sector activity such as Responsible Steel, is going to be a really useful first step, but we need to broaden that out to a wider set of countries, really capturing major producers and major consumers of steel. I think in parallel to this process, we can make really fast action, I think, on scaling up high quality commitments to purchase near zero emission steel. So once everyone is on the same page about what is green steel and what isn't, I think then we can start to create these lead markets, which we're already seeing. I think there is about 65 companies now which have which are kind of signed up to these commitments under organizations like Steel Zero, the First Movers Coalition, and also under the IDDI, which Rana will talk about, where consumers feel like they can pass through these costs through their products, like vehicles, like houses, like white goods, to really kind of spread the cost of decarbonisation over a larger consumer base, which can really help accelerate progress in the near term. One area which I think is going to be really important for supporting that broader set of fast followers in those trade discussions is immediately increasing public and private funding for research and innovation. So I think it's really great that we can see 20, 30, 40 demonstration and pilot projects on near zero emission steel within Europe and North America. But I think if we look at the bulk of steel demand that's going to come down the pipeline in the next 10, 20, 30 years, about 3/4 of this is going to come from emerging and developing economies. So until we get near zero emission steel projects in India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Brazil, Mexico, then we really haven't won the battle on steel decarbonisation. So expanding and better resourcing those collaborative networks under organizations such as Mission Innovation is going to be really important for delivering the pace of steel decarbonisation that we need to see. And again, that's a really useful component to bring into trade discussions in terms of technology collaboration and sharing. And then finally, kind of strengthening that point a little bit, I think we really need to see increased investment or increased support for heavy industry transition under climate finance programs. So at the moment, we see about 2% of climate finance from 2002 to 2020 going to industry transition. But industry transition industry is responsible for about 20% of emissions. So we can see it's really underfunded in global climate finance programs. And so in seeing a scale up of that to also support some of that technology collaboration and sharing that I spoke about is also going to be a really important component of trade discussions to make sure that everyone can move along at a similar pace over the coming decades. So I'll stop there, but thank you again for inviting me, and hopefully those are useful food for thought for later in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ron, not least for kind of putting the spotlight on some of the kind of the trade measures that are potentially important in enabling all this work. I'm sure something we want to come back to here in this discussion, but also in the Committee on Trade and Environment. But last but not least, we're going to pass the floor now to Rana in UNIDO, who's going to tell us a bit more about IDDI, how people get involved, and what's going on. Rana, over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone from sunny Vienna. It's my pleasure to join you here today, and thanks for the invitation. Just to get us started, perhaps I would just like to start, if we can move on to the next slide, please, to set out also a bit why are we talking about steel decarbonization, and why IDDI also decided to really focus on this area. So as we saw in the video and also in the presentations that were made earlier, we need to really slash our emissions by 50% by 2030. And for that purpose, sorry, the next slide. Next as well. So this is why we are looking at steel and cement as well. So while the steel is part of the steel breakthrough and the breakthrough agenda, IDDI actually focuses on these two sectors, and primarily because industry on one side is really one of the largest emitters, and if we zoom into the emissions that are made by steel and cement in the next slide, you will see actually that these two sectors are among 5 of the highest emitting sectors that account for 70% of the industrial emissions, and together actually account for 14 to 60% of the global energy related emissions. So in terms of the opportunity that these two sectors present for us to actually meet our climate goals, there's a very high opportunity. At the same time, there are a number of challenges actually that when it comes to these sectors, and this is what we are trying to address within IDDI. And the challenges, if I can put them into sort of technology related challenges, finance related challenges, and also markets and policy-related challenges. And so, for example, on the financing side, we're talking about technologies that we need to push towards the commercialization. And again, steel and cement present very good opportunities to implement technologies like hydrogen and CCUS. However, the costs of these technologies are quite significant. And until today, we really don't have yet a company that has implemented these technologies at commercial scale. So how do we really move towards creating a market that also incentivizes for those first movers or the early adopters the implementation of these technologies? So this is where we started the IDDI, the Industrial Deep Decarbonization Initiative. Next slide, please. And so next slide, please. And so IDDI is actually a large coalition and diverse coalition of both governments, private sector, but also includes think tanks and philanthropies and academia, all really working together on creating markets for steel and cement. So in the next slide, you will see that we have already on board actually 8 countries. Next slide, please. Sorry, thank you. So we have 8 countries that are at the moment involved in IDDI. Of course, the UK was, along with India, the co-lead of the initiative. And we are still also in further discussions with more countries to join. The initiative also brings together a number of partners, in fact, more than 80 partners that contribute to the different working groups that are set up under IDDI. Now, what do these working groups really work on, and what approach does IDDI follow? The next slide, please. We actually focus on 2 key areas as a way of stimulating markets for green steel and green cement. So that is really focusing on issues related to data and standards, as well as green public procurement. Now, why those 2 actually points? Well, because on one side, we really need to focus on creating more transparent markets. And for that, definitions of what low carbon material or near zero material is actually quite an important part of it, to make sure that we are measuring and things the same way, and to make sure that while working on these definitions and standards, that we have policies like green procurement that calls on and demands for low carbon material, and that measures that equally. Next slide, please. So we have 2 elements as well to the initiative. One is more working on creating this enabling environment related to data and standards, and the other is actually working on creating a political will by mobilizing commitments from countries to work on and commit to green public procurement targets. So the piece around development of standards and also better data frameworks that capture embodied carbon on materials such as low carbon steel and near zero steel are part of this enabling environment that we would like to create, and essentially to move towards more transparent markets. Now, allow me to dig a bit deeper into what each of these pathways as well represents. Next slide, please. So within the first piece is like building a foundation to enable a thriving global market. And as was already mentioned, steel particularly is a largely traded commodity. And so if we would really like to tackle the decarbonization of steel and create transparent markets, developing global standards that are adopted, by more countries and harmonized across countries and regions is really essential. And we see quite a number of standards that are coming up in the meantime, in between standards that are put forward by industry, like zero steel and soon also zero concrete. However, we really need also governments and private sector to work together towards more harmonized standards, and we need to enable that as well through environmental reporting mechanisms, because that again will allow us to verify that there is a compliance against this standard, and will allow governments that are committing to green public procurement to evaluate really the bids in a more consistent and harmonized way. Next slide, please. Then in the second pathway, the green procurement, is we're trying to create that pull in the market for green steel, and maybe worthwhile to say, why are we focusing in this case on green public procurement? Well, in the countries that are already involved in the initiative, we know that actually green procurement accounts for, government procurement accounts for 25 to 40% of the purchasing power for steel and cement accordingly. And so as such, governments would be a very strong actor to really create these markets and help industries that are looking into the implementation of these quite capital intensive industries and technologies to actually take that step. And so it's essential for us to work within this pathway with government agencies on creating more harmonized maybe guidelines for how green public procurement programs run, understanding also data and where and how much in fact of the government spending is going into these materials, how much of these materials are used in different public construction projects. And so this will help us in creating a benchmark as well for these countries. And finally, as well, creating a platform where countries are sharing more knowledge and motivating each other to take really stronger action. And just to give an example, the infrastructure act that was recently passed by the US, I think it's a very promising sign to the market. There's a lot also to really look to and learn from the implementation of that act, and that would be very relevant in this case. Now, next slide, please. I just wanted to share some light on the Green Public Procurement Pledge that we have launched just a couple of weeks ago at the Clean Energy Ministerial in Pittsburgh. So this is a pledge. So this is the political ambition dimension that I mentioned. And so this is a pledge where we are asking governments to commit to 4 different tiers of ambition related to green procurement. So at the first level is actually, and related again to this point on data and better standards for embodied carbon reduction on materials, there is the first level of ambition, which is for governments to start the requirement for disclosure of the embodied carbon in cement, concrete and steel procured for public construction projects by 2025. So this is quite an important step that will help us in setting baselines, but at the same time, pushes us in a sense to really deliver against what are the standards that are going to be used for the reporting of the embodied carbon on these material. The second level of ambition is actually also to trigger the investment decisions today and because essentially to start having these reductions by 2030, we need to start implementing some of these projects today. And for that, we see that there is a need for governments to actually commit that they would no later than 2030 conduct project lifecycle assessments, and that they would also work on the alignment of their 2050 targets with their procurement targets with their 2050 reduction goals. And then the third level of ambition is actually meant to stimulate those projects by 2030, and that is actually for governments to start no later than 2030 requiring procurement of low emissions cement, steel, and concrete. And for that, we rely heavily on the IEA methodology that was put forward in the G7 report that Will already mentioned, which actually looks into the emission factors for each of these products and looks at it in a gliding scale, and where countries have the option to look at different scales, so from A to D, for example, in the case of steel, and to really choose the level of ambition that is applicable within their national circumstances, because that's also important. I mean, to speak to this point on carbon leakage and what's possible and what's feasible, you know, at the end of the day, each country is going to have to do that assessment internally with its own stakeholders, including industry groups and others, to really come back to us within the initiative with a commitment to which of these 4 categories, for example, they would be able to commit to. And then, so this is mostly to deal with the deployment of existing technology. Then the last tier of the pledge is more meant to boost the development of new technologies. And this is where we actually also encourage governments to work on starting 2030 requirement of procurement of a share of their cement and concrete and crude steel from zero emission material, and that is for signature projects. So within the initiative, we're going to be looking into definitions, what these signature projects mean, and we still need to actually do a bit more work on the definition as well of what low carbon and near zero concrete means. Next slide, please. Before closing, actually, I just wanted to give you also a bit of a highlight of what are our priorities now for the coming years. So over the past year or so, we've spent quite a bit of time focusing on the development of the pledge and working on providing some guidance also to governments in terms of target setting and you know, assessment of bids and all that. But over the coming year, we would really like to work more on mobilizing new countries that would commit both to the initiative as well to the as to the pledge. So for example, we have already Germany, UK, India, Canada committed to ambition levels 1 and 2, but Germany, Canada, and UK also announced that they are going to undertake national consultations to come back with a decision and a commitment towards ambition level 3 and 4. But we need to grow that number a lot more. We need to bring some of the main players in this field for sure, and in addition to the existing members. We also need to develop a better system to track the performance of countries against these targets and commitments, just to ensure that we go beyond just these announcements and that at the end of the day we have like concrete results that can be shared from this green procurement pledge. We need to also work more on knowledge sharing, and because this is a fairly new area and there's quite a lot of work to be done on agreeing on common you know, standards for product category rules and environmental product declarations for these products. And so this is where we see a high priority for us in 2023 to work on the development of an open data standard that defines better or develops a standardized methodology for the reporting of embodied carbon on these products. So essentially, you know, we really see this piece of on standards a critical one for enabling more transparent and clear markets and you know, commitments on green public procurement from a broader set of countries, critical critical to also stimulate this market globally. It's quite promising and interesting to see, for example, both Canada and the US in the initiative. Both countries do quite a lot of trading for steel. So I think it gives also industries on both sides a better level playing field to actually be part of such an initiative and work together on the development of these standards. So thank you. I think that's my last slide, and thanks a lot. And yeah, happy to take questions later, if any.
Thank you very much, Rana, for setting that out so clearly for us all. I'm now going to turn over to the panel, and I'm aware that Matthias in particular may have to dash off elsewhere. So I wanted to start with Matthias, but then kind of turn to the others. And I suppose the kind of the general question I'd really like to pose to all five of you really is, we've heard this morning about both the Breakthrough Agenda and also IWDI and how you're working to accelerate decarbonisation. What overall do you see the role of international collaboration as being on these initiatives? And I suppose in particular, kind of what role you see for us here in Geneva, in the WTO, in supporting you? Can we be helpful? Can we hinder your work? But what are you looking for from this organisation in particular? And can we start with Matthias, and then I go to Michael afterwards?
Thanks very much. Good morning from Stockholm. And just to pick up on that point, we need all hands on deck. Climate action is urgent. As colleagues have said, we need to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030. We're way behind. So all actors in the international on the international arena need to sort of to see what we can do collectively to contribute to those efforts. Ultimately, of course, climate action sort of rests on the action by individual member states. But what we see as the sort of what multilateral cooperation can do, and including for you in Geneva, is of course how that kind of collaboration can stimulate and spur and encourage action at the national level for national governments to sort of to set the right kind of policies in place to drive the transition to net zero. Just looking at to the picking up also on the Breakthrough Agenda, I think really all credit goes out to the UK and colleagues for sort of both hosting the COP26 and also carrying through the outcomes of COP26, and including the request to all parties to revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets during 2022. And we see the Breakthrough Agenda as an important vehicle for doing this. And I think also just to highlight that we're keen to see the Breakthrough Agenda being framed in the context also of new jobs and growth, which we believe to be the case in Sweden, where we're now experiencing something that we like to refer to as the green industrial revolution. A part of Sweden that was just a few years ago struggling with population decline is now experiencing growth. And two examples of this are the hybrid steel plant and the recently established H2 Green Steel, which both will be producing fossil-free steel. And hybrid has actually already delivered first example of that through in a truck being produced by Volvo. So by using the hybrid technology in the steelmaking process, Swedish steel producing company SSAB will actually decrease Sweden's carbon footprint by 10% and Finland's by 7%, since they have operations also in Finland. So what has made this development possible? Well, just let me highlight three perspectives that hopefully can also be relevant at the global level, including for colleagues in Geneva. First, as I mentioned just at the outset, getting the policy framework right. In our case, we set out our climate policy framework as sort of a way of implementing the Paris Agreement in our national jurisdiction, where we set out the target of being carbon neutral or climate neutral by 2045 at the latest. which in itself then of course provides market signals to investors and business actors sort of in the kind of direction that we see that the country is taking. Furthermore, the government also set up something we call the Fossil Free Sweden Initiative in 2015, which now has delivered roadmaps for fossil-free competitiveness in 22 different sectors, including several hard-to-abate sectors such as steel. Secondly, an international framework that rewards these investments is also a key element in the transition. And here, the nexus between carbon pricing and trade rules is really a key element. Within the European Union, the emission trading system has been one driver for investment, and internationally, there are these initiatives relating to carbon pricing and trade, such as the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And I'd also like to highlight the work within the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, where Sweden has been leading the work on one of these so-called Helsinki principles on carbon pricing. So committing to strive for open markets and updating the WTO rulebook in order to find global solutions to these global problems is sort of a key element of the work that we want to take forward. As was mentioned, you saw Lead It on one of the slides presented earlier, and Sweden is proud to lead together with India the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, launched in 2019, which aims just at that, to accelerate the transition within heavy industry. And we now have some 40 members in Lead It, both governments and private companies. And thirdly, also accelerating the demand for fossil-free steel, or sort of more broadly within industry. In Sweden, thus far, there has been more demand for fossil-free steel than its projected production. So creating large-scale international demand. To do that, definitions of carbon footprint and global standards are key, as colleagues have been highlighting. So that kind of collaboration regarding standards is really a key element to be working on. The First Movers Coalition has been mentioned also on the slides, and we're a proud member of that coalition launched at COP26, where companies then commit to purchasing a proportion of the industrial materials and transportation, for example, they need from suppliers using these near zero or zero carbon solutions, despite the premium cost of those. And in that case, in that way, sort of increasing demand for those kind of products. So sort of getting the policy framework right, having an international framework that supports this kind of development, and then of course also building demand for the products. Just three examples of how we see also that sort of collaboration at the international level can support these, and these various initiatives which are sort of bringing those kind of actors together, and thereby also supporting us in that work. And just finally, maybe to highlight what we see here as the opportunities in the transition to climate neutrality. I mean, we all know that the transition is urgent. We need to set these kind of policies and actions in place. But the Breakthrough Agenda and these various initiatives is also an opportunity to highlight the opportunity is in climate action and what it brings in terms of new jobs and growth, and sort of also putting climate action in that context, that it's not sort of about burden sharing, but sort of looking also what it brings in terms of opportunities for countries and actors across the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthias, for that, and for kind of setting all that out so clearly. Michael in Berlin.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, there's already been a lot said that I had on my notes to address. So I also, given the time, I will try to keep it short. But first, let me start with the notion of urgency, and underlining this notion of urgency. We already had that too, but I really have to say the 2020s are decisive years for setting the tracks to achieve net zero industry. In Germany, our goal is 2045. Globally, we need it by mid-century. And without this, we cannot keep 1.5 within reach. The new facilities that are being planned now and are set up this decade oftentimes are set to operate beyond 2050. So this is really critical. And as we all know, to reach our net zero climate targets, we need a fundamental transformation of production processes in industry. But however, we do have the technologies, as Matthias just pointed out, and driving this forward can be a job creation engine. However, this of course requires very substantial investments. We need oftentimes completely new production facilities, and we also need a buildup of enabling infrastructure, particularly hydrogen. In Germany, we are giving important impetus to both these areas with our climate action program, the Klimaschutz-Sofort-Programm, how it's called. I will not dive into that too deeply, but there's a lot of those levers are in there. At the same time, now that's national measures, given that industry products, we also heard that before, are oftentimes globally traded good, especially when we talk about steel and other metals. International cooperation is key to overcoming issues such as carbon leakage, and it's key also to driving forward decarbonization of the industry sector on a global level. The Breakthrough Agenda and IDDI, yeah, they are just the best examples we can have here. Again, I will not dive into them as they are already being presented. Let me just say, Germany is supporting both the Breakthrough Agenda and IDDI, and we regard them as cornerstones of advancing industry decarbonization. So the question was yes, and the answer is yes, international collaboration and initiatives are key to accelerate decarbonization. As already pointed out by Will, also Germany, based on that, we made industry decarbonization one of our points of focus in our G7 presidency. And again, thanks to Will and IEA, based on their report called Achieving Net Zero Heavy Industry Sectors in G7 members, we used the outcomes to advance technical work on standards and definitions, and made quite some progress there, and also assembled a policy toolbox for industry transition. So a list of potential policy levers we can use to advance industry decarbonization. Definitions have been highlighted as essential by all before me. I will do so again just to hammer home the message. We think that developing and agreeing on international definitions and standards is key for rapidly advancing industry decarbonization and market creation. Also, just one of the takeaways I have, we had the meeting in Pittsburgh in September, and one of the takeaways there at the industry roundtable was that those definitions are requested by industries. Industries do need definitions to guide investments, to make business cases comparable, and to facilitate also the buyers to navigate what is indeed a growing market. We think also here the Climate Club proposal by the German G7 presidency could play a role. I think a colleague of mine also introduced these ideas at WTO some weeks ago. Again, given the time, I will not dive into it. But here with the definitions, I think we also, that was being said before, but we do have here the link to trade. Near zero emission production must be the default business case, and this needs to be reflected in trade, and here WTO comes in. And if we look at the mapping, Will showed us for the Glasgow Breakthrough, specifically steel breakthrough, trade conditions are identified as one of the priorities of action. And I can align with Will's comments on that. There's a need for launching a strategic dialogue on trade of low and near zero emission steel, and certainly also other industry products in the very near future. I mentioned the urgency before, and yeah, clearly this dialogue should serve the purpose of developing over time ways to ensure that near zero emission industry products can compete in international markets. Now, I'm looking at this issues from an industrial policy perspective. So I can only encourage all the trade colleagues assembled here to look into this, and we need smart solutions on that do not hinder trade but facilitate these growing markets and facilitate making industry decarbonization becoming a job engine. And I think WTO is a place or the place to do that. So thanks.
Michael, thank you very much. And I see some common themes here, but not just about the urgency of this issue, but of the importance of international collaboration and of standards in helping business to actually make the most of this green transition, but also the kind of the role for trade in providing incentives and all this. And I'd kind of see if other three panelists can kind of pick that up on it. We've also got a question in from Chris Horseman of Borderlex about the importance of carbon border adjustment mechanisms and whether they're kind of a helpful part of the toolbox, I suppose. So perhaps Steph, Rana, and Will, as we kind of come back to you now to kind of for your take, particularly on the kind of the role of trade in all of this, you might want to pick that up. Can we start with perhaps with you, Will? So sorry, random order, but yeah, we've spoken a lot about the value of international collaboration. Where do you see the role of this organization here in helping your efforts? Like, can we help or can we only hinder?
No, thanks very much. So yeah, I certainly do think the WTO can help, and I think it's already doing some great work with the launch of the TESD and the kind of working groups underneath that to start those conversations. So I think first and foremost, WTO is a global forum for discussing trade, and I think using that global convening power is going to be really useful in the months and years to come. Also bringing in the relevant other international bodies like ISO, like IEA, like OECD, etc., to make sure you've got the right experts advising trade colleagues on the kind of the transition. And also, as Michael was saying, and this is like one of the hardest things that I've often found in international collaboration is convening the right experts in government. So you need a mixture of trade colleagues, of industry policy colleagues, of climate negotiation colleagues, all around the table to make sure that you've got the right brains in the room to be making the decisions that you need to take. And I think WTO can really kind of do some, I guess take some further steps to embed itself within that landscape that I showed earlier. So that trade colleagues and trade representatives at the WTO can better understand, key issues for the transition. So what is the state of technology for these different industry sectors that we're talking about? What financial assistance currently exists? What avenues do different countries have access to? Do we have agreed standards? Who agrees on those standards? And as Michael was saying, where is the private sector asking for those? So can we make faster progress in different areas? I think the WTO can kind of embed itself and kind of leave itself open to conversations like we're having today to upskill further on an area which I know is kind of growing importance over the past couple of years. And of course, the WTO on the other side can bring trade expertise where climate colleagues or energy colleagues don't have that area of understanding. And I think for too long, the two camps haven't spoken as much as we need to. And I think that really needs to change in the years to come. And I think you did ask earlier how the WTO could potentially block progress, but I think, can potentially slow down if, if we design climate policies or energy policies in isolation of trade and kind of country relationship understandings that WTO can bring to the table. And so we don't want to kind of put ourselves in positions where we're implementing policies which result in trade disputes, which can ultimately slow the pace of transition around the world. So I think that's going to be really important. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Will. Same question to you, Rana, and then to Steph, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, what could block progress is us not really talking about these issues and like trying to bring in all the relevant players on the same page. And I think we have already all started taking some of these actions. So just to say, for example, with colleagues from WTO and the British Standards Institute, we are convening a side event at the site of COP27 to actually start that discussion. So I think it's very promising now with this conference today, but also with the interactions we have with the colleagues in WTO and others, to actually really come up with perhaps a joint roadmap of where we could collaborate and where we could. So I'm not sure I have the answer for you exactly today on that, but what I'm saying is, like, we are starting to discuss this, and we hope to come back with sort of a roadmap for where we can collaborate also better with colleagues from WTO. What I wanted to say is actually, it's wonderful, I mean, that this discussion is happening, and it's a very exciting time, in the climate space, that we are actually really tackling issues related to steel and cement, and these are harder to abate industry. And for sure, thanks, a big thanks goes to Sweden and India with and also to the World Economic Forum for starting these discussions within Lead It and the Mission Possible partnership. But it's also time now to bring the developing countries closer to this, emerging economies also closer to this, because while we are all looking into how to trigger investments, and we need to make sure that those investments are also happening in developing and emerging economies, we need to ensure that also new plants are not being built in these economies. And so this is where I see that also we can perhaps collaborate a bit closer, and try to see how do we bring a stronger also developing countries and emerging economies voice into this discussion, and ensure that while we are moving towards this industrial transformation that Michael referred to, that we are doing it in a just and more collaborative way. So this is what we are hoping as well. We could at least set the, some steps at during COP27. So just really bringing more voices also from developing countries on the topic, and particularly on technology collaboration, which is going to be essential actually for developing and emerging countries to make steps towards that. Because while we are, it's great to see also some agreement or consensus around definitions among the G7, but essentially we need to move that consensus beyond the G7 to the G20, and to even be a wider set of countries, to really make sure that this transformation is happening in a wider context as well. So these are also, in my view, and some of the topics that we are trying to also advance ahead of the end of the year, and now for COP27 and COP28. And we're really excited to actually collaborate with colleagues from WTO on this.
Rana, thanks very much. Steph.
I'll keep it quick. That I agree with what's already been said. I mean, ultimately, we have to design our trade system to account for these huge sweeping changes we are going to see in the global economy in the next 10 years. We're going to see more low carbon, zero emission products entering the market. There's a question now, I think, of opportunity capture as well as risk mitigation. So how do we make sure our trading regime reflects that? And I very much agree, conversations between the climate world, trade world, and those in between are absolutely vital to get that right.
Thanks, Steph. I'm going to just kind of pick sort of three specific questions to our original three panelists, if I may, and kick off with you, Will. I mean, you've set out very clearly kind of what you've been doing in this area. If there was kind of one specific area where you think you'd really, I mean, where you really like the kind of international community to focus to see progress, which would it be?
So I think it's really got to be standards and definitions for near zero emission products and materials. I think they unlock so much more in the later pathway for decarbonizing. They provide a kind of foundation for discussions on trade, so people are kind of aware of the correct ambition levels. They also provide a basis for providing technical and financial assistance, so you understand, what projects you're funding are actually going to be net zero compatible, which we've had that kind of understanding in previous sectors for years now, but in some of these materials where the supply chains are much more complex, I think there isn't that same level of understanding. And of course, they're really powerful in unlocking some of the procurement levers that Rana was talking about as well. So I think they're going to be really important. And I think, just to say, we're seeing some positive momentum, both at the country and the company level. So obviously, Mikhail, we've already spoken about the G7 group of countries who are looking to support and kind of continue the discussion on standards and definitions. And we hope that continues next year under the G7 and the G20. But also at the company level, we've seen Responsible Steel launch with their GHG standard for steel a couple of weeks ago, supported by that same IEA definition. So we're seeing an alignment both at the public and the private level about what that level of ambition needs to be. And we just need to kind of scale that to a larger group of companies, a larger group of countries, so we don't arrive in a situation, 3 years down the line where we've got 15 different standards and consumers at the other end have got no idea what is, 1.5 degree compatible and what isn't. So I think we need to quickly, converge efforts and ambition into a set of standards, both at the public and private level. So thanks very much.
Steph, quickly, I know you've got a dash. Is this sort of, what do you need to see from specifically from countries now?
I think the key thing that countries need to do, as well as taking action domestically, is get behind some of these initiatives that we already have. I think the question that we often face and faced before COP26 was, there's just an explosion of initiatives, which is great, but I think we're at the point now of this transition where we need to be able to get behind a core set of key activities, be it on trade, on standards, as Will said, but also on efforts like IDDI, which Rana spoke to, which is all about getting the right players around the table to grow the markets for green industrial products. So I think it's about us as a kind of international community being able to agree how and what we want to work on and how we want to work on that, and then being able to crowd in efforts behind that to accelerate the transition as well. So yeah, I'd really encourage anyone from a country on this call, but also from the private sector as well, to read the Breakthrough Agenda report. We'll be launching these priority actions at COP27 to look through them and think about of that plan and of those activities listed, where can you get involved to kind of bring your contribution to this global effort.
Thanks very much, Stefan. Just got lastly from Rana, kind of how do we encourage more countries to get involved in IDDI?
For me, it's actually the sense that this change has to happen now. I mean, there's this urgency to act. There is a drive to work on the standards, and if you don't intervene today, or if you're not part of this discussion today, we might really get to a situation where, as Will was saying, in a couple of years, we're going to have a multitude of standards. And that's what we want to avoid. Like, get involved today, because that's the time now to actually really work and agree on these standards and move more, collectively and coherently together on a topic that really needs us all to act together. And really, I think this is now our plea to go back to the countries and really explain to them why is now the right moment for action, and what they are also getting from being involved in initiatives such as IDDI. But also for us, it's also quite important to say we are not, IDDI is just part of this landscape, and also these pieces of the puzzle really just amplify each other's efforts and help us to create a more systemic impact. So I hope that also collectively, as a community working on this topic, that we can reinforce these messages also more to countries and come up with a narrative that is quite appealing in a sense for all the countries to join.
Rana, look, thank you very much. And I mean, let me thank all 5 of our speakers, particularly our 3 panelists, you, Rana, Will, Steph, but also Michael and Matthias, who joined us from Stockholm earlier for this morning's session. Thank you for kind of, I think, you know, I take away a number of really key points, both of all the urgency, what we're doing. I think we all know that across the piece, and we've heard it in various fora this week, both here in Trade and Environment Week, but also in our discussions in the Committee on Trade and Environment. We all know why this is so urgent and why it's so important. I think I've heard, you know, I think you've set up very well, if I may say, through you kind of why these particular sectors are of such significance in all of this, and of the importance of international collaboration on this. Both the initiatives we've spoken about this morning have their role to play, but how we can expand them out to a broader range of countries. And obviously, I think it's a particular point about how we make this relevant and useful to developing countries. We've heard, I think, about the importance of standards across this piece. And I think kind of the question that comes back to us, and which, you know, you've all touched to one degree or another, is the degree to which working here in the WTO we can help these processes, help these initiatives, help these efforts by incentivizing good behavior, enabling the uptake of these new low carbon technologies globally. And I think what this morning has done is offered us all real food for thought for that, and issues which I'm sure we'll want to kind of discuss further, both within the Committee for Trade and Environment, but also the TESD as well. So thank you very much to all 5 of you, 4 of you who are still on the call, but also to leave us. Thanks to everybody who's joined us in person here in sunny Geneva this morning. Ron, if it's sunny in Vienna, it's even sunnier here. So I'm very grateful for everybody who's decided to forego a little bit of morning sunshine to join us and discuss these important issues here. And I'd like to thank all the team behind this here who've been involved, Alice, Andrew, Joe, and others, WTO Secretariat, but also our interpreters who make all this possible here this week in Trade and Environment Week in Geneva. So thank you all very much. Great food for thought, and I hope food for action as well. So thank you very much. Have a very good day, everybody.
Thank you. Good day.